Naughty Dog are a company with some odd traditions. After they made 3 Crash Bandicoot games, they decided to finish off their run with the series with a racing game. At the time it kind of made sense, as putting cartoony video game characters in their own kart racer was the thing to do. So, after they finished the Jak trilogy, what did they decide to do? They decided to once again finish off their time with the series by making a racing spin-off called Jak X, or Jak X Combat Racing in America. It seems like an odd choice, but after looking into it, it turns out that the main reason they decided to make a racing game was to give the company some breathing room before having to move to PS3 development, which we now know was a strain on any company initially. Jak X over time has largely become a forgotten game due to it being so different to the original games, and unlike Crash Team Racing, wasn't relevant to the rest of gaming when it was released. This made me curious to whether or not it was any good, but I didn't have high hopes. I hated the races in Jak 2, and I only liked them better in Jak 3 because there were less of them. But expectations aside, is Jak X any good? Does it uphold the level of quality you would expect from Naughty Dog, or is it a lazy spin-off to milk the franchise? Let's take a look. Jak X takes place 1 year after the events of Jak 3. Jak and Co attend the reading of Crew's will, Crew being a gang boss who was killed in Jak 2. After everyone has a toast, a hologram of Crew reveals that he has poisoned everybody there. To get the antidote, they must now take place in Crash City Championships for combat racings and come in first. The rest of the game is Jak trying to win the championship while also trying to figure out exactly what is going on and why Crew would poison them. I was initially unimpressed by the story, as it's a weak reason to have everyone taking part in a race. However, Naughty Dog put as much effort into the story and cutscenes of this game as they did with the original trilogy. This means the voice acting and writing is great, and thanks to the large amount of cutscenes, the story is more fleshed out than you would expect. The story doesn't have the same scale as Jak 2 or 3, but the fact that they managed to add a decent plot into a racing spin-off is impressive within itself. The story doesn't feel tacked on, and instead helps create a more complete single-player experience. Jak X is a racing game with elements of Burnout, Twisted Metal and Mario Kart. The vehicles control like they did in Jak 3, only they've been refined for driving on racetracks rather than a large open world. The controls are simple. X makes you go, while square and circle are your brake, which you can also use to power slide into reverse. There are 4 different power-ups you can pick up while racing. Yellow power-ups give you offensive items such as grenades or missiles that let you attack the other races and are assigned to R1. Red power-ups give you defensive items such as mine and turrets and are assigned to L1. You can use red power-ups to either create obstacles on the track, or when somebody has fired a weapon at you, you can use your red item to block it. There are also green health and blue boost pickups. The way races work is that everyone has a health bar which gets depleted if you crash or get shot at. When you run out of health, you explode and have to respawn, which is why I mentioned Burnout earlier. As everyone has health, it means that races aren't purely determined by how well you drive, but also how well you can blow up the other races while staying alive. When racing, there is a pack-like quality to trying to win. There are 2 main reasons for this. The first is that there is rubber band AI. What this means is that no matter how well you drive, you will never be able to get too far ahead of the AI races as they match your speed. I will be fair though, it doesn't really affect the races too much, as it doesn't feel like cheating on the AI's behalf. It just means that you'll never get too far ahead of everyone else. AIs also don't slow down if you fall too far behind, so it's possible I'm just being paranoid about the rubber band AI, but even if I was doing really well in a race, I found it almost impossible to gain a good lead. The second aspect of the game that makes the race feel like you're just fighting out in a pack is the items themselves. I won't go through all of them, but many of the yellow items can instantly take out other racers. The main offender for this is the Peacemaker, which seeks out and destroys whoever is in first place and is very hard to block. The Peacemaker usually appears several times in a race, so it's hard to stay in first place for a long amount of time. Being destroyed isn't that big of a deal though, as you respawn fairly fast, so if you're in first, being destroyed won't put you in last place. Making the races come down to trying to survive in a main pack has its positives and negatives. It's great as it keeps the races frantic and you always need to be on your toes if you want to win. It's bad as it means most of the race doesn't matter. You will be changing positions constantly throughout a race, but whoever wins mostly comes down to who gets lucky with the items for the last 30 seconds of the race. The game is balanced enough though that it definitely doesn't feel broken, and overall I would say they did a great job of creating a racer that requires skill to get around each track, but also feels like a party racer. The main mode of the game is the adventure mode, where you play through the story by competing in 4 different cups. Each cup has a certain number of events which are split among the 4 locations where the tracks take place: Spargus, Crash City, Haven City and the Icelands. The individual tracks are specific parts of each location put together, which means some tracks share certain sections. The track design for the most part is good and has a nice amount of variety and large open worlds for you to fight the other races in. There aren't really shortcuts, but some tracks do feature alternative parts to use. There are some tracks though that I just can't stand, as they feature small inclines that send you into the air. Sometimes you will be thrown in the air and land completely fine, but other times you will either smash into a wall, clip some part of the environment, or land weird, which causes you to spin out. As I mentioned, on most part of the courses this isn't a problem, but on tracks such as Waterworks Circuit, there's definitely a frustration to how much the game throws you into the air and it causes you to mess up. Now you could argue that these jumps only feature in the later tracks and these are supposed to be harder tracks, but in order to do well in these courses you have to slow right down to go around corners, which goes against the fun, frantic nature of the rest of the game. There are other modes outside of circuit races. There is Death Race, where you drive around a track destroying weak dummy cars to score points. It's not a bad mode and a nice distraction from the main races. There's Freeze Rally, where you have to try and get the best time for 2 laps of a track. There are timers on the track that you have to collect, which will freeze your time for a certain amount of seconds. I'm not a big fan of this mode, but that's only because I don't enjoy time trials in races in general, but it's a nice way of mixing up the traditional time trial. There's Turbo Dash, which is my favourite mode of the game. You race against other racers, but instead of items there are only power cells. Once you collect a power cell, you then have to boost for long enough to activate it. Once activated, it will fire at an opponent and you score a point. It's the best mode as it focuses on pure speed and you don't have to worry about being randomly blown up as much. The last mode for normal races is Rush Hour, which is the worst mode by far. It requires you to smash into opposing traffic and score points for doing so. I don't hate Rush Hour, but when you hit traffic it can sometimes cause you to spin out and crash, which makes the mode more annoying than it should be. Outside of the races are also arena type modes where you compete against other drivers in more circle-like areas. The modes are Deathmatch, where you destroy other drivers for points using items, Sport Hunt, where you score points by shooting at runners in the map, Capture, which splits everyone into 2 teams where each team is trying to grab the power cell on the map and bring it back to their base, and there's Artifact Race, where you have to grab artifacts that randomly spawn on the map. For me, these arena modes were just a distraction from the main game as, just like with any kart racer, I find it awkward having to drive around a circle-right arena shooting at people. The amount of modes that Jak X offers is very impressive, and while I wouldn't say they're all amazing, there's none that I hated, and the different modes keep the game fresh and entertaining. The music for the game was composed by Billy Howardell, who is the guitarist for A Perfect Circle. I find the music to be like any other Jak game. It's either great or forgettable with little middle ground. A problem with the music in this game is that there are no track-specific songs. The soundtrack is a collection of instrumentals which play randomly when you race. For games such as Need for Speed or Burnout, having random songs play for each race works, as they use licensed music with vocals. Trying to do the same in Jak X with non-vocal music just doesn't work, and not being able to associate songs with specific tracks is a letdown. Speaking of letdowns, Jak X is the buggiest Naughty Dog game I've played. There's a glitch in the game where the autosave will never stop trying to save, which for some strange reason disables the start button during races. It happened to me at least 10 times while playing through the game, and my solution was to remove the memory card, let an error appear, reinsert the memory card and save manually. This is a common problem that many people had to deal with, and it's disappointing that it never got fixed. I also had another problem where the game would freeze on me and I would have to restart the game. It happened most often after a cutscene would play and it just wouldn't load up the race. I was playing the game on a PS3, which might have been the cause of the problem, but I never experienced anything like this on any other PS2 game I've played, so I can't say for certain whether it was the PS3 or not. If anyone else has had these problems with the game, please let me know in the comments, as I couldn't find anything online about the issue. With this being a racing game, of course there are multiplayer modes. When the game was first released you were able to play 8-player online using LAN, but the servers are no longer up. You can still play 2-player split screen, but I found it to be quite lacking. First of all, only being able to play with 2 players rather than 4 means you're unlikely to play over games like Mario Kart. Second, the amount of options you get is very limited. You can choose out of a decent number of races, cars and modes, but there's no proper options. You can't change how long a race is or set up any sort of Grand Prix. It's disappointing, and it means you probably won't spend too long with the multiplayer once you've tried each game mode a couple of times. The third thing that brings the multiplayer down is the technical issues. There are certain tracks that are completely disabled from the multiplayer, and others that have blatant graphical problems with parts of levels disappearing. It can make some games almost unplayable, and maybe it's just my PS3 again, but I felt like it was more of a problem with the game itself. The multiplayer isn't bad, as the core racing is still fun, but the split screen feels like an afterthought, which is odd for this sort of racing game. The adventure mode took me around 10 hours to beat, which is more than enough for a racing game. I know it only says 98% on the screen, but that's because the game froze trying to load up the credits, and I didn't want to have to complete the final Grand Prix for a second time. Jak X at its core is a solid racing title. The balance of items, AI and track designs mean that the races are fun to play and are always manic. Burnout Revenge is one of my favourite PS2 games, so I personally really enjoy the style of racer that Jak X was going for. The single player mode is also better than expected, offering many different modes to play and a complete story. There are problems, however, that stop Jak X from being really great. The amount of ways you can instantly be killed might frustrate some, and the technical problems are baffling considering how well put together the original Jak games were. The shallowness of the multiplayer also brings the game down. My score is 7.0 out of 10. Not Naughty Dog at their best, but thanks to a well-rounded single player and fun core gameplay, Jak X is an enjoyable spin-off.